Marcus Webb arrived in Calhoun County on a Monday in March, carrying one suitcase and a cover story about a cousin who lived nearby. He rented a room from an old woman named Mrs. Tatum who charged $400 a month and asked no questions as long as you didn't smoke inside. He paid in cash. He said thank you. He learned which floorboard creaked near the bathroom and avoided it every morning at 5 when he woke up to start his day. He had been doing this kind of work for 11 years. The room was small. One window faced the parking lot. The mattress was the kind that remembered every person who had ever slept on it. Marcus didn't mind. He had slept in worse places for worse reasons. At least here the reason was good. He spent his first 2 weeks just walking. Grocery store. Barbershop. The diner on Clement Street where the coffee was bad but the booth in the back gave him a clear view of the door. He introduced himself as Marcus Webb, between jobs, thinking about settling down somewhere quieter. People believed it because it wasn't entirely a lie. He was Marcus Webb. He did prefer quiet. The job, however, was not quiet. The job was Judge Carol Patton. She had been on the bench for 11 years. In those 11 years, she had built a reputation for being sharp, efficient, and fair. The local newspaper had called her fair 3 times in print. 2 of those articles included a photograph of her shaking hands with someone from the city council. She had good handshakes. Firm. The kind that made people feel like the matter was settled before it began. But there were numbers that the newspaper had not printed. An analyst back in Washington had spent 8 months with those numbers. Conviction rates sorted by defendant race. Sentence lengths compared side by side. Bail decisions mapped against zip codes. The numbers told a story that Judge Patton's handshakes did not. When the defendant was white, she found reasons to be lenient. Extenuating circumstances. First offenses. Good families. When the defendant was black, the same facts produced different conclusions. Same charge. Harsher sentence. Faster gavel. And her brother-in-law, a man named Darren Coles, owned 3 private correctional facilities in the state. Each facility received state funding based on occupancy. The fuller the facility, the more money Darren Coles made. The more money Darren Coles made, the more comfortable his sister's family lived. Marcus had read the full report twice on the plane down and once more in his rented room with the window facing the parking lot. By the 3rd reading, he didn't feel anger exactly. It was something older and quieter than anger. Something that had been sitting in his chest since he was 17 years old and watched something similar happen to his uncle in a courtroom in Georgia. His uncle had not been an FBI agent. His uncle had not walked out a side door 40 minutes later. His uncle had served 4 years. Marcus folded the report and put it in the false bottom of his suitcase and went to sleep. The arrest was arranged for a Thursday. There was a jacket. The jacket had a pocket. The pocket had something in it that Marcus had not put there, because that was the point. 2 local officers, neither of whom knew the full shape of what they were participating in, responded to an anonymous tip about a man in the Riverside parking lot. They found Marcus exactly where the tip said he would be. They found what the tip said they would find. Marcus kept his hands visible. He spoke clearly. He did not argue. At the station, they gave him a phone call. He called a number that rang twice and connected to nothing, which was the signal that the recording equipment in the courtroom had been tested and confirmed operational that morning. He was assigned a public defender named Priya Anand. She was 28, maybe 29. She had dark circles under her eyes and a pen tucked behind each ear and a way of reading documents that made her look like she was having an argument with them. She came to see Marcus the evening before the hearing and spread 4 pages of notes on the table between them. The search has a problem, she said. The officer's report puts him on the north side of the lot. The security footage puts him on the south side. That's not a small discrepancy. That's the kind of thing that gets evidence thrown out. Marcus looked at the pages. He nodded slowly. Also, she said, the evidence log has a 40-minute gap between collection and submission. That gap has no documentation. No signature, no notation, nothing. So what does that mean? Marcus asked. It means, Priya said carefully, that in front of a reasonable judge, we win this. Maybe not easily, but we win it. Marcus looked at her. She believed what she was saying. She was right to believe it. Under normal circumstances, she would have been correct. "Let's see what happens," he said. Priya looked at him for a moment like she wanted to say something else. Then she gathered her papers and said she'd see him in the morning. The courtroom smelled like old wood and the particular kind of silence that buildings develop when they've held too many important moments. Marcus sat at the defense table in the shirt they'd let him change into, which was clean but slightly too large at the shoulders. He kept his hands folded on the table. He kept his face neutral. Judge Carol Patton entered and the room stood. She was small, not in a fragile way, but in the way of someone who had long since stopped needing physical size to take up space. Her robe was perfectly pressed. Her hair was silver at the temples in a way that looked deliberate. She moved to her bench the way people move when they are completely certain of every step they are about to take. She looked at the courtroom. Her gaze passed across Marcus at the defense table. It was a brief look. The kind that lasts less than a second. But Marcus had been trained to notice what lived inside brief looks, and what lived inside hers was a conclusion she had already reached. Priya argued well. She was calm and specific and she did not raise her voice, which Marcus knew was the right choice because raising your voice in front of a judge who has already decided tends to confirm whatever the judge has already decided. She laid out the location discrepancy. She laid out the evidence log gap. She cited 3 precedents from the same state, 2 of which had resulted in suppression under nearly identical circumstances. Patton listened. She took notes on a small pad with a black pen. Her face was attentive and pleasant. Then she ruled against suppression. Her reasoning was smooth and detailed and arrived at its conclusion with the confidence of someone reading a route they have driven many times before. Marcus watched the pen in Priya's hand stop moving mid-note. He watched her take a single breath through her nose. She didn't look at him. The trial portion was short. The evidence, now admitted, was presented. There was a witness who was brief and certain. There was no defense witness because the defense case had largely rested on the evidence not being there at all. The jury took 11 minutes. They returned guilty. Priya touched Marcus's arm lightly when they came back in. It was the involuntary gesture of someone who had not yet learned to keep that reflex professionally contained. He didn't move away from it. Sentencing was the same afternoon. Judge Patton looked at the file. She looked at Marcus. She spoke about the seriousness of the charge and the importance of accountability and the necessity of consequences that reflected that seriousness. She used the word community 3 times. She sentenced him to 3 years. Mandatory. She noted that parole consideration would not begin for 18 months. The gavel came down. She moved to her next case before the sound finished. Marcus was walked through a door that was not the main door. He was in a federal vehicle within 22 minutes. The jacket he'd been wearing went into an evidence bag. A man named Torres, who had been Marcus's contact for the duration of the operation, handed him a coffee and said nothing for several blocks. Then Torres said, "She gave you 3 years." "She did," Marcus said. "Whole thing is on recording." "Clean." "Good." Torres looked at him. "You all right?" Marcus drank the coffee. Outside the window, the city moved past, doing its regular Thursday things, people walking, a delivery truck double-parked, a child pulling ahead of a tired-looking parent on the sidewalk. "I've been better," Marcus said. "Let's finish it." The next 6 weeks were paperwork and patience. The evidence was compiled and submitted and reviewed and compiled again. The sentencing data from 11 years of Judge Patton's courtroom was organized into exhibits. The financial records connecting Darren Coles's facilities to the sentencing patterns were verified by 2 separate forensic accountants who agreed with each other, which the lead prosecutor said was rarer than it sounded. Marcus wrote his portion of the report in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building 2 blocks from the courthouse where he'd been convicted. The report was factual and precise. He did not include anything about his uncle in Georgia. That was not relevant to the case. He included it in a different document. A private one that he typed and then deleted and did not type again. The marshals arrived at the courthouse on a Wednesday morning. They were 3 of them, all federal. They wore suits that were too clean for local government work and walked with the specific posture of people who had not come to observe anything. Patton's clerk, a woman named Barbara who had worked in that courthouse for 19 years, watched them cross the lobby and noted that people moved out of their way without being asked. She would describe this later as, "You just knew. You could feel it before you understood it." They went to chambers. The door closed at 9:14 a.m. It opened again at 9:55 a.m. What happened inside that room was not recorded, because Judge Carol Patton was not the subject of a covert operation in her own office. She was simply being informed. Calmly. Precisely. In the language of federal procedure, which has no soft edges. She was informed that Marcus Webb was a federal agent. She was informed what he had been sent to document. She was informed what had been documented. She was informed that this was not the end of the conversation but the beginning of a much longer one. Barbara watched the judge walk out of chambers and go directly to the women's restroom at the end of the hall without stopping. Patton had never, in 19 years, left chambers without speaking to Barbara first. Not once. That afternoon, a case on the docket was postponed. No reason was officially given. This had not happened in 11 years. From a parking garage 3 blocks away, at 6:17 p.m., Patton made a phone call. The number she called was her brother-in-law's. It rang 8 times. He did not answer. She stood in the parking garage for another few minutes after the call ended. Then she walked back to her car. Then she sat in it for a long time without starting it. The indictment came on a Tuesday, 6 weeks later. It was 47 pages. Darren Coles's name appeared on page 3, in a sentence that was factual and brief and contained more consequence than most people pack into entire paragraphs. The financial arrangement between the sentencing patterns and the facility occupancy rates was laid out across 12 pages that read like math and landed like something much heavier than math. A spokesperson for Judge Patton released a statement about her long commitment to justice and her decades of service to the community. The statement used the word community twice. Marcus was not at the press conference. His name was in the court documents but not in front of any cameras. He didn't have opinions about cameras. He had been doing this work long enough to know that the visible part, the press conference, the statement, the newspaper article, was not the actual work. The actual work was the 47 pages. The actual work was the 8 months of sentencing data. The actual work was 11 years of consequences finally being counted. He was in a different city by the time the press conference happened. He had already rented a new room. This one had a window facing a street instead of a parking lot, which was a minor improvement. The mattress had the same memory as all mattresses in rooms like this. He learned which floorboard creaked. He bought coffee from a corner store on the block and found a booth in the back of a nearby diner where the coffee was equally bad but the view of the door was clear. He opened a new file. He started reading. Back in Calhoun County, the courthouse went on with its days the way courthouses do, full of people carrying situations they hadn't chosen, standing in rooms that would decide things about their lives, hoping that whoever sat behind the bench that morning had come to work that day as the person they were supposed to be. The name placard was removed from Judge Patton's bench by a maintenance worker on a Thursday. 2 screws. It took less than a minute. The chair behind the bench sat empty for 3 months while the administrative process moved at administrative speed. Priya Anand, the public defender, learned what Marcus Webb had actually been the same day the indictment was released. She read the news article twice. She sat with it for a while. She felt several things that she couldn't have listed in order. Then she went back to work, because her caseload did not pause for her to process things, and because the people in her caseload needed someone who showed up. She still had the pen behind her ear. She still argued well. The new judge who eventually took Patton's bench was younger by about 20 years. She had spent a decade in public defense before moving to the other side, which gave her a particular kind of vision, the kind you develop when you've stood where the defendants stand and felt the weight of what comes down from the bench. On her first day, before her first ruling, she paused. It was a small pause. Half a second, maybe less. The kind that only means something if you're watching for it. She was reading a file, a bail hearing, low-level charge, young man who worked at a warehouse and had no prior record, and she paused and looked at the file and looked at the young man and paused again. Then she said a fair bail. Then she moved to the next case. The air conditioning, which had finally been repaired, hummed steadily. The old wood walls held the sound of the gavel the way they held all sounds, absorbing it into everything that had come before. Outside, a man in a slightly too large shirt walked out of a corner store with a coffee in his hand. He didn't look at the courthouse as he passed it. He had no reason to. That chapter was in 47 pages and a closed file and an empty chair. He turned the corner. He kept walking.